They said John Abruzzi once ended a war in Chicago with just one phone call, and by sunrise, 3 men had vanished without a trace. In a city built on smoke, steel, and betrayal, his name carried more weight than the law itself. He wasn't feared because he shouted. He was feared because he never had to. Every table went quiet when he entered. Every promise turned fragile when he looked your way. But the most dangerous thing about a king like Abruzzi is not the enemies he knows, it's the traitor sitting beside him.
In this first episode of John Abruzzi, The Fall of the King, we begin with the king at the head of the table, entering the tense back room of Tucci's, where John Abruzzi rules with fear, authority, and a growing sense that something inside his empire is beginning to rot. Next, the leak in the empire, as suspicion sharpens over stolen money, broken loyalty, and a hidden weakness threatening to tear through the family from the inside. Then we move into The Brothers Marked for Death, where accusations against the Castiglione brothers appear to offer answers, yet beneath the surface, darker intentions begin to reveal themselves. We'll also see the friend beside the throne, focusing on Falzone, the loyal underboss whose calm expression conceals ambitions far more dangerous than anyone at the table realizes. Finally, we arrive at The Crown Weighs Heavy, as the trap tightens and betrayal reveals itself not from across the street, but from the chair right next to the king.
Chicago didn't sleep that night. It watched, it listened, it waited for John Abruzzi to close his eyes, because in his city, darkness belonged to him. In the back room of Tucci's, under dim lights stained yellow by years of smoke, the air was thick with stale cigars, expensive wine, and the quiet panic of men who understood that one wrong glance could become a death sentence. At the head of the table sat Abruzzi, heavy with power and heavier with expectation. He held a glass of red wine in one hand, but there was nothing relaxed about him. His fingers curled around the stem like they were holding the throat of the whole room. His eyes moved from face to face, measuring, weighing, judging. He wasn't simply looking at his men, he was searching them. In this life, no one stayed powerful by trusting appearances. Then he spoke.
Loyalty.
Just one word, but in Abruzzi's mouth, it sounded like a verdict already delivered. It's not a currency you spend, it's the blood in your veins. You lose it, you die. That was the law of his world, not the law in a courthouse, not the law printed in books. This was the law written in whispered threats, sealed with handshakes, and enforced with disappearances. To men like Abruzzi, loyalty was sacred, because without it, power collapsed into paranoia. And tonight, paranoia had already entered the room before anyone else. The family was bleeding. Money was disappearing from the union pension funds, the very engine that kept Abruzzi's empire rich, stable, and untouchable. Those funds were not just accounts on paper. They were influence, protection, and the golden stream that fed everyone at the table. If someone was skimming from them, they weren't just stealing cash. They were cutting into the heart of Abruzzi's kingdom. Worse still, the feds were beginning to sniff around the loading docks. That meant pressure. It meant attention. It meant that somewhere out there, somebody had either gotten sloppy or somebody wanted the empire exposed. And for a man like John Abruzzi, there was only one thing more offensive than an enemy on the street: a rat inside the walls. But kings are never most vulnerable when they stand alone. They are vulnerable when they believe the men closest to them still kneel in faith. And as the smoke curled upward and silence pulled tighter around the room, the man seated at Abruzzi's right hand was already steering the night toward blood. What looked like a meeting of discipline was quietly becoming the opening move of a far deadlier game, and that game would soon begin with the name of two brothers.
To Abruzzi's right sat Philly Falzone, his underboss, his oldest friend, the man who had stood beside him long enough to be mistaken for family. Falzone wore loyalty like a second skin. His face carried the perfect expression, respectful, controlled, unreadable. The kind of face that calmed nervous men and reassured suspicious ones. But there was something in his eyes that didn't move with the rest of him, something too skilled, too careful, too rehearsed. That stillness mattered, because while Abruzzi was focused on the leak, Falzone was focused on the collapse. The money draining from the pension funds had already created fractures through the organization. Men lower down the ladder were growing nervous. Capos were beginning to question numbers that no longer added up. Associates started watching one another instead of watching the streets. In organized crime, fear is manageable when it comes from the boss, but when fear starts coming from uncertainty, it spreads faster than fire. And then there were the federal agents circling the docks. The docks were more than a business hub. They were a pipeline of goods, of favors, of silent agreements that made powerful men richer by the hour. If the feds pushed too hard there, they wouldn't just uncover shipments, they'd uncover patterns, meetings, names, payments, the kind of threads that once pulled could unravel years of careful insulation. That is why the room felt so dangerous. Every man present understood they were no longer just dealing with missing money. They were standing on the edge of exposure. One misstep, one informant, one weak nerve, and the entire structure could come crashing down. Falzone broke the silence with the confidence of a man bringing relief.
We found the leak, John.
Simple words, smooth words, the kind that instantly redirect tension. All eyes shifted to him. In another setting, it might have sounded like good news, but in that room, under those lights, we found the leak was not a solution. It was the beginning of a sentence that could decide who lived long enough to see morning. He slid a manila envelope across the polished wood. That envelope carried more than paper. It carried accusation. It carried strategy. It carried a story crafted with just enough truth to survive the first glance. Falzone had come prepared, not just to offer Abruzzi a target, but to offer him one that would satisfy his anger and distract him from the hand truly guiding events. Inside the family, a leak could be tolerated for exactly 1 second after it was confirmed. After that, the clock belonged to death. And as Abruzzi reached for the envelope, the machinery of suspicion shifted into place. The room believed it was about to witness the naming of traitors. What none of them realized was that they were also witnessing the brilliance of a betrayal so intimate, so patient, that it had been seated beside the boss all along. Yet the envelope was only the spark. The fire itself was hidden inside the evidence.
Abruzzi opened the envelope and spread the contents before him. Photographs. Grainy, distant, but clear enough to wound. 2 low-level soldiers, the Castiglione brothers, caught in what looked like a secret meeting with a rival gang leader known only as the Irishman. The images carried all the poison they needed. In this world, context didn't always matter. Appearance was enough. Suspicion was enough. Association alone could get a man buried. Abruzzi stared at the photographs, and his jaw tightened. The brothers were nobodies in the grand structure of the family, but that almost made the accusation cleaner. Low-level soldiers were expendable. They knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be mourned too loudly. If they were talking, if they were planning to flip, then eliminating them would feel less like a risk and more like necessary maintenance. That's what made Falzone's move so effective. He hadn't accused a capo. He hadn't pointed upward where resistance would form. He had aimed at men just visible enough to blame and just disposable enough to erase. It was elegant in its cruelty, the kind of lie that worked because it understood the psychology of power. The photographs were real. That was the genius of it. Yes, the Castiglione brothers had met someone. Yes, the meeting had happened. Yes, the camera had captured them in proximity to danger. But truth was only a fragment of the weapon. The rest was invention. The narrative had been manufactured, stitched together so convincingly that by the time Abruzzi looked up from the photos, the damage was already done. In his mind, possibility was hardening into certainty, and certainty in a man like Abruzzi was lethal. The room stayed silent because everyone understood what came next. Nobody rushed to defend the brothers. Nobody asked questions. Nobody demanded proof beyond the photographs. In criminal empires, men do not survive by interrupting a capo when his anger has found a direction. They survive by nodding, by agreeing, by making peace with the fact that someone else's death may buy them another week of breathing. But while Abruzzi saw treachery in the photos, Falzone saw opportunity. This wasn't simply about getting the Castigliones killed. Their deaths would do more than silence two innocent men. It would create movement, panic, retaliation. It would push the family into chaos at the exact moment the feds were circling. And chaos was useful. Chaos blurred patterns. Chaos left people sloppy. Chaos left Abruzzi exposed, distracted, and easier to isolate from the truth. For one small moment, barely visible, the corner of Falzone's mouth twitched upward in a private flicker of satisfaction, a smirk so brief it disappeared almost as soon as it was born. No one in the room seemed to notice, no one except the audience watching from outside the smoke and silence of the scene. That smirk changes everything. Because now the danger is no longer limited to a pair of accused soldiers or a shrinking river of money. Now the danger has a face sitting inches from the throne. And once suspicion turns outward, the real predator can keep moving undetected until it is far too late to stop him. Still, a fabricated accusation is only half the story. To understand how deadly this night truly is, we have to look closer at the man who delivered it with such calm precision.
Philly Falzone was not just another lieutenant. He was history. He was memory. He was the kind of man who had been around long enough to know where all the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. He and Abruzzi had survived wars together, built alliances together, spilled blood under the same streetlights. That shared past made him more than useful. It made him believable. And believability is the sharpest knife in a conspiracy. Falzone understood something many ambitious men never learn. The easiest way to overthrow power is not by charging at it. It is by standing close enough that no one notices when your hand starts tightening around its throat. He did not challenge Abruzzi openly. He did not raise his voice, gather visible enemies, or wave a banner of rebellion. Instead, he performed loyalty so convincingly that even his deception arrived dressed as service. That is what makes him terrifying. A loud enemy can be confronted. A reckless enemy can be anticipated, but a patient one, an enemy who knows your habits, your temper, your weak points, your blind spots, that enemy can guide you toward your own destruction while still calling your brother. Falzone knew Abruzzi's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability, his belief in the sacred order of the family. Abruzzi could handle police pressure, he could crush rivals, he could outlast threats from the street. But betrayal inside his inner circle, that cut differently. It clouded judgment, it demanded a reaction before reflection, and Falzone was counting on exactly that.
By feeding Abruzzi a believable lie, he was not just redirecting suspicion, he was weaponizing Abruzzi's own code against him. If Abruzzi ordered the Castiglione brothers killed, he would set off a chain reaction, fear among the soldiers, whispers among the capos, unease among allies who would start wondering whether the boss still saw clearly. Every choice made in anger would deepen the instability. Every execution would make the family more brittle. And under that pressure, Abruzzi could be made to look weak, irrational, even vulnerable to law enforcement. This is how empires fall, not always with gunfire, but with misdirection, with manufactured evidence, with a trusted man quietly moving pieces until the king is stranded on his own board. The tragedy is that Abruzzi still does not see it. He sees the missing money, he sees the federal pressure, he sees disloyal soldiers in photographs, but he does not yet see the architect sitting at his side, speaking softly, breathing evenly, waiting for the moment when trust becomes fatal. And once that realization comes, if it comes at all, it may arrive with sirens outside, bodies inside, and no safe place left to stand. Because the final stage of betrayal is never the lie itself. It is the moment the victim acts on it and steps directly into the trap waiting ahead.
In the world of John Abruzzi, power was never a privilege. It was a burden, a crown made not of gold, but of pressure, blood, and sleepless vigilance. To rule meant to suspect, to survive meant to punish, and to hesitate meant to invite your own funeral. That is why this night at Tucci's matters so much. On the surface, it is a meeting about stolen money and disloyal soldiers, but underneath, it is something far more dangerous, the beginning of a silent coup. Abruzzi believes he is confronting betrayal. In truth, he is being choreographed by it. Every photograph, every carefully chosen word, every controlled expression on Falzone's face is part of a larger design, a design meant to turn the boss's instincts into weapons against himself. The genius of the trap is its intimacy. The threat is not coming from a screaming rival at the gates. It is not marching in from another neighborhood with guns drawn. It is seated at the same table, close enough to pour the wine, close enough to offer advice, close enough to whisper the names of the men who should die next. That is the cruelest truth of all. In empires built on fear, the deadliest blow rarely comes from an outsider. It comes from the person who knows exactly how your trust was built. And so the title becomes more than a phrase. The crown weighs heavy because every decision made by a king carries consequences too large to contain. If Abruzzi strikes too fast, he becomes the instrument of another man's ambition. If he waits too long, the leak spreads, the feds close in, and the family begins to smell weakness. Either way, the pressure is crushing. This is the tension that gives the story its pulse. A king senses danger, but not its direction. A trusted friend offers answers, but hides the blade. Two brothers stand on the edge of execution for a crime shaped by manipulation. And all around them, Chicago watches like a city that already knows blood is coming. Because it is. What happens next will not simply test Abruzzi's power. It will test whether instinct is enough when deceit has already entered the bloodstream of the family. The smoke-filled room, the envelope on the table, the stillness in Falzone's eyes, these are not isolated details. They are warnings, signals, the first cracks in an empire that may soon discover that betrayal, once invited inside, never leaves quietly. And when the next chapter begins, the question will no longer be whether someone is lying. It will be who dies first when the truth finally stands up.